Today we're going to start looking at some basic ideas in argument evaluation. So basic ideas about what makes an argument a good argument or a successful argument. We'll talk about two separate criteria for evaluating arguments: truth of premises and support. I'll talk a bit about both of them together, then each of them in turn a little bit. Then we'll look at we'll look at support in a little more detail, and we'll see that there are two basic fundamental kinds of support: deductive support and what's sometimes called inductive support. So, if an argument is an attempt to justify a claim by giving reasons, then a successful argument is one that succeeds in doing that, which really does give you a good reason to believe that the conclusion's true. So various terms are used to label arguments that do their job in that sense, that are successful in that sense. You might come across terms like cogent argument, sound argument. You might even come across valid argument used for that. We'll use valid in a slightly different way. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just saying good argument. A good argument is, one that really does give you a reason to believe the conclusion. So I'll typically use good or successful to mean an argument that does its job, which really does provide you with a good reason for accepting a conclusion. Given any argument, no matter what the subject matter, there are always two different questions that you can ask about it that are relevant to whether it's a good argument or not. One question is whether the premises of the argument, remember that's the reasons given in support of the conclusion, whether the premises are true or not. You can always ask that question. That's a good question to ask about an argument. The other question is whether the premises support the conclusion. And what I mean by that is this. Support is a technical term, as I'm going to use it. To say that the premises of an argument support a conclusion is to make a conditional claim. It certainly doesn't mean the conclusion's true. What it means is this. It means if the premises were all true, that would give you a good reason to accept the conclusion. That doesn't mean the premises are true, right? It just means if they were, you'd have a good reason to accept the conclusion. Right? So that's what I mean by support. It's a conditional concept. If the premises were true, it'd give you a good reason to believe that the conclusion was true. This is how I'll use the term valid. I'll describe an argument as valid if it satisfies that condition, if the premises support the conclusion in that conditional sense. You can also say that the conclusion follows from the premise, something like that. Right? But that means if the premises were true, the conclusion would be true, or give you a good reason to believe the conclusion. Sometimes people use this term, valid, just for a special kind of support, deductive support, which I'll talk about a bit later. I'm not going to use it in that way. If I want to disambiguate, I'll say deductively valid rather than inductively valid. But if I just say valid, I just mean the premises support the conclusion in this conditional sense. If an argument satisfies both of those conditions, then it's successful or sound. Right? Yeah. Because look at the conditions. The conditions say, if the premises are all true, that gives you a good reason for accepting the conclusion. And then the second condition says, and the premises are all true. Right? If both of those things obtain, then obviously the argument succeeds. The argument really does give you a good reason for thinking the conclusion is true. These are independent conditions, if it's not already clear. An argument can satisfy one but not the other. An argument can satisfy neither. Let's look at some examples. This is an example, simple example, of an argument where the premises do support the conclusion in this conditional sense. Whoever the murderer is, they must be left-handed. There's a premise. Suppose you've got some reason to think that. I don't know, you see you're a detective investigating a murder, right? And from some clever deduction you make about the way the blood is splashed on the walls or something, you can work out that the murderer must have been left-handed. One of your suspects, Miss Green, you know, is not left-handed. So, conclusion, she can't be the murderer, right? You can rule her out. Clearly, if your premises are true, if you're right that the murderer must be left-handed and Miss Green isn't left-handed, then it follows that Miss Green can't be the murderer. Right? So the premises do support the conclusion in this conditional sense. But that doesn't mean the premises are necessarily true, right? You might be wrong. Perhaps you're wrong in thinking that the murderer must be left-handed. Perhaps you're wrong in thinking that Miss Green is not left-handed. Perhaps you just asked her and she said, no, I'm not left-handed, I'm right-handed. Right, well, she could be lying. So the premises might not be true. But if they're true, it's pretty easy, I think, to see. Conclusion must be true. So the premises do support the conclusion. This is a valid argument. Conclusion follows. Is everyone convinced that it's valid? You can see why the premises support the conclusion. I can try and explain that a bit more if you like, but I'll just move on if you're kind of happy with it. Okay. I'll move on. Now consider this argument, which makes the same point. This is also a valid argument. All tigers are mammals, and all mammals are carnivores, therefore all tigers are carnivores. Again, in this argument, the premises support the conclusion, right? If they were true, the conclusion would be true. But this time, you ought to be able to tell straight away that not all the premises are true, right? One of the premises is false. Which one is false? Yeah, not all mammals are carnivores. Second premise isn't true. Nonetheless, if they were true, so this isn't a cogent argument, because although it satisfies the second condition, or first condition, depending on what order you put them in, although the premises support the conclusion, not all the premises are true. Notice the conclusion is true. Tigers are carnivores, right? What this shows is something I'll try and emphasize again and again. You can have a bad argument, an unsuccessful argument, for a true conclusion. This is very, very important. So I'll say it again. You can have a bad argument for a true conclusion. Let me say the same thing in a different way. Just because the conclusion is true, that doesn't mean the argument is a good one. That seems like it should be kind of obvious, but in fact it turns out to be quite difficult for people to apply that principle in practice. What people tend to do when they're evaluating arguments is look at the conclusion and ask themselves this question. Does that conclusion seem true or plausible to me? And if it does, then you're kind of satisfied. And, okay, it must be an okay argument. Right. But that's a serious mistake. You'd be making a serious mistake if you thought this argument was a good one just because the conclusion was true. I'll mention this again as we go along and maybe have some more about it next week too when we talk about my side bias. How about this example? Now, so far I've given you two examples where the premises do support the conclusion. Here's an example very similar to the first one where the premises don't support the conclusion. First premise is the same. Whoever the guilty person is, they must be left-handed. And now the second premise says, oh look, and Miss Green is left-handed. Aha, so she must be the murderer. Right. But you see why this doesn't follow? Even if the premises were true, the conclusion isn't necessarily true. Can anyone explain it? Why don't the premises support the conclusion in this case? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the murderer has to be left-handed, but that doesn't mean that everybody who's left-handed is the murderer.
Yeah, were you going to say the same thing? Yeah. Of course, there are billions of left-handed people in the world, right? They can't all be the murderer. So just because Green is left-handed, that doesn't mean she's the murderer. All you know is that the murderer is one of the left-handed people. Good. Again, it could turn out that Miss Green is the murderer. Right? So it could turn out that the conclusion of this bad argument is true. Still a bad argument. Still not a good reason for thinking that the claim is true. The argument still fails even if the conclusion is true, even if Green is the murderer. Finally, here's an example of an argument, simplest one I could think of, that satisfies both conditions. So this is a fully cogent or successful or good argument. All birds lay eggs. That's true. I'm just waiting for any biologists or botanists in here to refute me. Okay, good. All birds lay eggs, that's true. Penguins are birds, also true. Conclusion, penguins lay eggs. This argument is both valid if the premises were true. Conclusion would have to follow. Conclusion would also be true. And as it happens, the premises are all true. So it's a cogent argument. So, just to summarise, there are these two conditions, two questions, if you like, you can ask about any argument. In a cogent, successful argument, the premises support the conclusion in this conditional sense. That if the premises were true, they would give you a good reason to accept the conclusion. And the premises have to actually be true. If both of those things are satisfied, then you've got a cogent argument. But as we've seen, an argument could satisfy one but not the other. The premises could support the conclusion. The argument could be valid, but not all the premises are true. It could have true premises but not support the conclusion. It could fail to satisfy either condition. Right? It could be doubly bad argument. The premises don't support the conclusion and some of them are false as well. The thing I really want you to remember though is this last point. An argument can fail to be successful even if the conclusion is true. Let's have our first little quiz then. Has everyone got a pack of cards? Just put your hand up if you haven't. Very simple question first. True or false question. If all the premises in an argument are true, then they support the conclusion. Is that B, which is false. Of course, true premises don't necessarily support a conclusion. Here's an example. Sheep are mammals, that's true. Some mammals are carnivores, that's true, some are. But it doesn't follow, does it, that sheep are carnivores from those premises. I just want to tell you this example. It's another famous example of the fact that true premises don't necessarily mean that the conclusion is supported. When Galileo first started looking through telescopes at the stars and planets, he saw, when he was looking at Jupiter, what appeared to be moons orbiting Jupiter. So he saw these sort of bright dots very close to the disk of Jupiter that sort of appeared to be moving around from day to day, week to week. This kind of rather buggered up the current sort of astronomical theories of the day, which said there were only 7 planets which moved in these sort of concentric crystal spheres. So a lot of astronomers of the time thought this couldn't possibly be right, and lots of people thought, well, he's using this fancy new bizarre thing called a telescope. What the hell is that? You know, it could be anything, could be seeing anything, could be seeing little flaws in the lenses or something. This astronomer, Francesco Sizzi, offered a different argument for why Galileo couldn't possibly be right and there must be only 7 planets in the solar system. He said this, look, there are 7 windows in the human head, right? 7 openings in the human head. 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, a mouth and 2 ears. Therefore, the number of planets is necessarily 7. So notice something about this, right? His premise is perfectly true. If we ignore the metaphor of windows, it's perfectly true that there are people who've got 7 kind of holes in their head. But from a modern perspective, you know, what you want to say about this argument is what the fuck has that got to do with it? Right? Completely, apparently irrelevant. Perfectly true premises, but certainly from a modern perspective, don't support the conclusion at all. Okay, how about this? If the premises are all false, then they cannot support the conclusion. False, which is correct. Good. Because the term support, you know, also has an ordinary language meaning as well as a sort of technical meaning I've given to it, people often think that something like this must be right. How could false premises support a conclusion? But in the sense in which I'm using the term support, they can. Here's my favourite example of an argument with false premises which does support the conclusion. And in fact, it's a true conclusion in this case. All Australians drink beer is the first premise. That's actually false, right? Not all of them do. Some drink wine, some drink nothing at all. Sam is an Australian, Sam here being me. Right. I'm not an Australian by birth, I'm a filthy Pom, I'm afraid. Conclusion, Sam drinks beer, right, which is true. The premises are both false, but if they were true, the conclusion would be supported. So false premises here support this conclusion which happens to be true, but might not have been. Yeah?
So we would say it supports it, but does it still mean it's not a sound?
Yes, that's right. It's not a sound or cogent or successful argument because not all the premises are true. That's exactly right. Yeah. So for this kind of reason, support is not an ideal word because it suggests it's kind of a bit ambiguous, right? You just got to remember that I'm using it in this special kind of technical sense to mean valid, in effect. Yeah. Entail, yeah, that's not a pretty good word. Yeah. Implies, you could say. Conclusion follows is another locution that I'll use sometimes. So I'm going to talk a bit more about each of those conditions in turn, starting with truth. So in order to evaluate an argument according to those criteria, you have to decide whether the premises are true or not. Right? How do you do that? How do you decide whether premises are true? Okay, so now I'm going to give you a general purpose recipe for deciding whether premises are true or not. No, I'm not. Wish I could, but there's no such thing. There's no such thing as this, the trutholator. There's no thing, there's no machine or device or recipe or algorithm or general purpose procedure that you could use where you could somehow input claims into it in either a natural language or some kind of special formal language, and it would just tell you after a while perhaps of computation whether it was true or not. There's no such thing. It's not, by the way, just that no one's built one yet, or it would sort of contravene the laws of physics, or something like that. It's in principle, logically, mathematically impossible that such a machine would exist, except in certain very, very, very narrow domains. I'm not going to talk any more about that, but that's a result of various theorems in mathematical logic, some of which you may have heard of. For example, Gödel's theorem tells you, in effect, that there's no truther-later. That's not how Gödel put it, of course, but that's the import of his theorem. So, no general purpose thing I can tell you. Here's how to tell whether things are true, right? If I could do that, we wouldn't need this course, really, would we? We wouldn't need arguments at all. We just put the conclusion in, and it would tell you whether it was true or false. So instead, what we do is we can do a bit better, though, than just saying, well, just go out and find out whether it's true or not. For certain types of claim, there are certain questions you can ask about them, which can help decide whether they're true or false. One reason you might have for accepting a premise as in an argument as true is that it comes from some kind of expert authority, or perhaps a witness. Witness testimony in the law is actually the kind of gold standard criterion for truth. Of course, witnesses and experts aren't infallible and are sometimes unreliable, sometimes contradictory. If you remember the little piece about how to get babies to sleep that I mentioned last time. So you need some criteria for deciding whether you should believe a source or not. And that's something we're going to talk about in more detail in, I can't remember exactly when, week 5 or 6. How to evaluate sources, experts or witnesses. You might come across a premise that's kind of beyond reasonable doubt or common knowledge. We've seen a few examples of that already, right? When I had those kind of tigers are mammals, tigers are carnivores, that kind of thing. Right? Beyond reasonable doubt, common knowledge, that. You could accept a premise as true if it's like that. We'll also look at these two things later on. If the premise is a generalization, and by generalization I mean a claim that says all things or most things or a certain percentage of things are a certain way, a claim like that. You can evaluate generalizations like that by a technique called trying to think of counterexamples. That's something we'll look at in more detail too, a bit later on. The premise offers an explanation of something. It says the cause of it, of a certain thing is this, or the reason why this is happening is this. Then one approach to deciding whether that is true is to think about whether you can think of any plausible alternative explanations. What else could explain it? Of course, you will come across arguments which have premises where none of those questions really help, and so you end up just not knowing. You don't know whether the premise is true or not. No idea. Right? That is a fact of life. You'll come across arguments with premises where you don't know whether they're true or false. That means you can't fully evaluate the argument. You don't know whether it's a cogent argument or not, because you don't know whether the premises are true or not. But you can still then ask the other question, well, suppose these premises were true, would that give me a good reason for believing the conclusion? In other words, you can see whether the premises support the conclusion. Suppose the answer to that question is, oh, look, no, they don't. Even if those premises were true, conclusion wouldn't be supported. Then it kind of doesn't matter anymore for the purposes of argument evaluation whether the premises are true. You know the argument can't be fully cogent, right? Because the premises don't support the conclusion. So it's still useful to do that. We will be spending probably 75% of this unit looks at this question of support, how you can tell whether premises support a conclusion or not. Because that's the thing that you can do without knowing whether the premises are true or not, which is really useful. Right. Okay, truth, tick, there we go. Done truth. Excellent. So, support. Just to remind you again, what I mean by support is this conditional claim. If the premises are true, they'd give you a good reason to accept the conclusion. How do you decide that? Well, we'll look at how that idea applies to specific kinds of argument at various points, and we'll look in more detail at this concept of deductive validity. There are sort of special tests for deductive validity that we'll talk about next time. For now, I'll suggest 3 kind of questions that you can ask that can help you to decide whether the premises of an argument support the conclusion or not. The first 2 all involve essentially thinking about what could make the conclusion false. What things would falsify the conclusion? That's thinking in those terms actually takes some practice and skill. Because normally, when you're presented with a claim, the way most normal human beings understand claims is to think in terms of what would make them true, not what would make them false. So it takes a bit of practice to sort of think, okay, what would make that false? What you do is this. Here's the first question. Can you think of a possible situation in which the conclusion is false? You're imagining some way the conclusion is false, but the premises are still true. If you can think of a situation like that, that means that it's not necessarily the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion is, or whenever the premises are true, the conclusion is, or in any situation in which the premises are true, the conclusion is. Because you've been able to think of a possible situation where the premises are true and the conclusion isn't. So that's a good question to ask. Quite hard to think about sometimes, though. So if you're trying to think in those kind of terms and it's not working, try, because sometimes the concept of a situation in which the conclusion is false or a situation in which the premises are true doesn't quite make sense in the particular kind of argument you've got. So, try this question. Second question is essentially doing the same thing, but it's phrased a different way, and so you might find it more helpful in some arguments to think like this. Can you think of any facts or considerations or things that might be true that would undermine the conclusion, that would count against the conclusion, but which are consistent with the premises? Again, if you can, that undermines the claim that the premises support the conclusion. Another useful technique is to try this. Can you think of a similar argument, an analogous argument, which is obviously kind of invalid, and which is obvious that the premises don't support the conclusion? The easiest way to do that is to try and think of an argument of the same kind, which has obviously well known to be true premises, but obviously false conclusion. We'll see a bit more about that method next time. Let's look at some examples. Here's a simple one to start with. This is an invalid argument. Premises don't support the conclusion. Everyone who lives in Melbourne lives in Victoria. That's true, right? Joan lives in Victoria, let's suppose. Therefore, Joan lives in Melbourne. Does anyone want to have a go at explaining why that conclusion doesn't follow, why that's an invalid argument? Yeah?
There are places in
There are places in Victoria other than Melbourne where Joan might live. Exactly. Give me an example. Everyone says Geelong normally. But yes, of course, Mildura, Geelong, Ballarat, are all these places. So if you think about it, what you just did was you thought of a possible situation. Joan lives in Mildura, or some other town in Victoria that's not Melbourne. And in that situation, the conclusion's false, but the premises are still true. Right? She still lives in Victoria. That's important. And you haven't sort of mentally rearranged the sort of political geography of Australia. Right? Everything's still the same. So we've applied that first technique to get this one. Does that make sense? It's a possible situation. In fact, there's lots of possible situations in which the premises are true and the conclusion isn't. Right? How about this one then? Having the death penalty for serious crimes acts as a deterrent against committing those crimes. Since we want to reduce the number of serious crimes in our society, we should reintroduce the death penalty. Conclusion of that argument is that we should reintroduce the death penalty, right? And there are two premises. One premise says that the death penalty acts as a deterrent, and the other sort of less controversial premise says, and we want to, have less murders and things like that. If you were debating this kind of argument, probably a lot of attention would focus on the first premise, right? And there'll be a lot of argument about whether that premise is true or not. Right? And I want you to sort of ignore that, if possible, and ask a different question. Suppose it was true. Does the conclusion necessarily follow, though? There's no kind of necessarily right or wrong answer to this, but it's maybe practice with asking this second question. Because the sort of possible situation idea doesn't seem to help much with this kind of argument, it seems to me. So what about this then? Are there any considerations which would count against the conclusion? Reasons for not reintroducing the death penalty, right? But which are quite consistent with the claim that it's a deterrent.
They get it wrong.
Yeah, right.
People didn't necessarily commit the crime.
Good, yeah, that's the one I would have thought of too. A consideration that counts against the conclusion is, look, no matter how good your legal system, sometimes you might execute an innocent person. And so that's a bad thing, presumably, everyone can agree. Perfectly consistent with the claim that it deters people. But now the argument looks a bit weaker. Right? Yeah. Let's try the third technique then. Can you think of a similar argument? This is the technique people are using when they say, well, that can't be right. That's like arguing. And then they give you a similar argument, which is obviously kind of dumb. And you're supposed to think, because that second argument is dumb, and it's relevantly similar to the argument that's just been given, the first argument can't be right. So look at this example. Lions are carnivores. Sheep are not lions, so sheep are not carnivores. Conclusion's true, right? But this is a bad argument. So, now this is difficult to do this without practice, but can anyone think of an argument which is like that, but which is kind of much more obviously mistaken? I think it's not quite immediately obvious that this is an invalid argument because everything in it is true, right? The premises are all true and so is the conclusion. So it leaves people with this sort of vague feeling of, oh, it must be okay. Yeah. Hey, that's good, isn't it? Australia is in the southern hemisphere. New Zealand is not Australia. Therefore, New Zealand is not in the southern hemisphere. Yeah, excellent. That works. That's, how can you tell that's a bad argument? You can tell because the premises are true and the conclusion isn't. It's well known. Right? So that's clearly a bad argument, and it seems very like this one. Anyone think of any more? Exactly. And here's a simple one is just to change one word in that. Change sheep to tigers. Right? lions are carnivores, tigers aren't lions, therefore tigers aren't carnivores. That's more obviously. So this is, it's, something you're obviously quite good at it. I'm impressed. It can be quite difficult to do this though, but it's a useful technique. Can you think of a similar argument? We'll talk in more detail next time about exactly how you might get a bit more precise about that concept of similar. What makes these arguments similar to each other or the same as each other? It's to do with the form or pattern of reasoning. What these examples show is that the pattern of reasoning involved in that first argument isn't reliable in the sense that it can take you from true premises to a false conclusion. I want to now briefly mention that there are two types of support. I think, all the examples that we've seen so far where the premises support the conclusion have been examples of a special kind. Examples where the premises support the conclusion deductively, or the argument's deductively valid. So in all these examples, they all have the same characteristic, which is this. If the premises in those arguments are true, the conclusion must be true. Couldn't be false. There's no way, no possible situation at all in which the premises are true and the conclusion's false. All right? So that's how we'll define deductively valid. So sort of, if you like, this is the strongest way in which premises can support a conclusion. If the premises are true, that rules out any possibility whatsoever that the conclusion isn't true. That's like maximal support that premises can provide for a conclusion. But that's not the only way. That's not how we defined support, right? When I defined support, I said, if the premises are true, they give you a good reason for believing the conclusion. Obviously, if the premises support the conclusion in that sense, that gives you a pretty damn good reason for believing the conclusion if the premises are true. But it's not the only kind of good reason that premises could give to a conclusion. I want to introduce the other kind of support that premises can have for a conclusion with this little film clip, which comes from a film which is full of arguments. Nearly all the dialogue in this film consists of arguments of one kind or another. So it's really quite an interesting film from the perspective of critical thinking. And it's got Johnny Depp in it. It is, of course, the first and greatest Pirates of the Caribbean film.
They didn't make more. There's just the one.
Yeah, I agree. There can be only one. So this little segment introduces an argument that's not deductively valid, but is very, very strong. Not deductive. Right, so this argument that I wanted to draw your attention to, that one. Signals over 1,000 feet high. The entire Royal Navy's out looking for me, so they're going to find us. Right. This is not a deductively valid argument. It's possible that the Royal Navy don't find them, even if the premises are true. Right. But it's very unlikely. So in this kind of example, it seems like the premises do support the conclusion. If they were true, they give you good reason for believing the conclusion. But it's not deductively valid, right? 'Cause it's possible that even though the premises are true, the conclusion isn't. So we can define an inductively valid argument to be one where the truth of the premises makes the conclusion very likely to be true. It doesn't rule out all possibility that it's false, but it makes it very likely.